My name is Niki Desautels. I have a background in conservation education and public outreach with a specialty in all things bats. I've been a part of Bats Northwest for several years, and I'm going to introduce them to you real quick just to kind of give you guys an idea of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to start off talking just a little bit about bats around the world, some basic biology and natural history, so that we're all on the same page about how cool and awesome they are. And then we'll jump into bats of Washington State and specifically talk about the bats in your area, particularly around the Methow Valley, which is a really great place for bats in Washington State. Before moving and go through some life cycle, who's there, what we've got in Washington, how they live their lives, what they look like, what they do, and some of the threats they're facing before we jump into some conservation angles where we can talk about what we can do to help bats in our state and help protect them so they can keep benefiting us as much as they do. So first of all, Bats Northwest. While we are based in Western Washington, we work across the state on conservation education and research issues around bats. That can be anything from talks like this and visiting classrooms to helping kind of consult on conservation programs if someone's looking to improve habitat, put up bat houses, conflict management with bat species around the state. And then we also assist in research efforts with government organizations and private organizations that are looking to monitor bats or capture for research. Whatever it is, if it involves bats, we tend to jump in and help. We also support a lot of the state's wildlife rehabbers who are focused on bats and any other projects that people come up with. So let's dive in. First of all, I always like to talk to people about just how diverse they are. So bats are found on every continent in the world except for Antarctica. They fill almost every niche within habitats and ecosystems except for really extreme cold, tops of mountains, and of course, Arctic and Antarctica area. And so they're one of the most diverse species of mammals on Earth. And the way that they have adapted to all of these different environments and all of these different ecosystems is really amazing. And we're going to explore that a little bit now. So as you can see, just as a quick snapshot, they've done that by really evolving a wide range of physiology that kind of helps them with the different ecosystems they live within, whether those are extreme temperatures in deserts, really diverse and full places in the tropics, or our more temperate areas that we have here in Washington State. They come in a whole range of looks and sizes. I often equate bats to the diversity between like a hummingbird and bald eagle. We kind of have everything in between. And you can kind of see that in faces and colors. And it really is good to kind of think of bats as more than one thing, because a lot of times, especially around Halloween, we kind of think of that black bat silhouette as being what a bat is, when in fact they are incredibly different. And we're going to just kind of see how they do that in all their different places. So starting off, to kind of hone that in, bats, there's actually 1,469 different species of bats in the world right now. It's changing all the time as scientists develop better technology and we learn more and we discover new species. We're still finding new bat species all the time because being nocturnal, they can be very hard to study. And so we're learning a lot, especially through the advent of some of our DNA sequencing, where we can kind of find out that one species we thought was the same in different places may actually be two different species of bats. That sometimes happens in the reverse, where we actually discover that two species we had separated out are actually the same species doing slightly different things in slightly different places. So that means that aside from rodents, bats are actually the second biggest group of mammals that we have. They make up 1/5 of all mammals on Earth. So 1 out of every 5 species of mammals on Earth is a species of bat. And they are incredibly different from the smallest bat on Earth, which is our Kitti's hognose bat, which we affectionately call a bumblebee bat, because they are so small that a full-grown bumblebee bat is only about the size of my thumb with a very small wingspan. And they eat insects and live in Thailand. On the other side of that scale, we have the greater flying foxes, which we sometimes call the fruit bats, but the flying foxes can be quite large. As fruit-eating bats, they can have a wingspan of up to 5 to 6 feet across, making you kind of think like you've got a dinosaur flying overhead, but a very harmless one who's really just looking for some fruit. And then everything in between. And so as we move through, we can talk about the actual group, the order that bats are a part of. So bats are often thought to be part of the rodent family, which they're not. They're part of their very own family called Chiroptera, that is actually more closely related to animals like carnivores and shrews and moles than they are to rodents. And so you can see from this that they actually have a very mammalian-looking skeleton, a very, changed up version of us even, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. But the word chiroptera is actually comes from the Greek word for hand, chiro, like a chiropractor, and ptera for wing. So that's because if you look at the skeleton, you can kind of see how these elongated fingers of a bat's hand make up the structure of their wing. So that makes them a lot different than the way that like birds fly with their wings, or insects fly with their wings. These fingers are very, very long. Imagine if our fingers reached all the way down to the floor. And between those second and fifth digits, so everything except the thumbs, they'll have a wing membrane that then connects to their ankles. And then on our smaller bats, they'll have a tail membrane between those two ankles and another wing on the other side. And so what that means is that they fly very differently than birds. And that's one of the things that is really interesting to learn about bats. Some people are a little afraid of bats, and often that's because they have a very erratic flight. Well, that erratic flight is really based on the dexterity that they have in the wings that is formed by their fingers. So just like we can use our hands and our fingers to move, so can bats. And so when they fly, they're not just flapping their arms, they're actually moving those hands through the air and pulling themselves through the air, which gives them the ability to twist and turn and flip, and really makes them kind of the acrobats of the sky. And they've evolved to fly that way so that many of them can follow their favorite food, which is insects, who have very erratic flights. And they're able to kind of follow that along. They have a great precision in how they fly. It makes them very hard to catch. And the size and shape of their wing, which we'll talk about a little bit later, can kind of determine how they fly, where they hunt, what they hunt. And it's really interesting to figure that kind of stuff up. In fact, the fastest mammal on Earth is actually not a cheetah. It's a species of bat, the Mexican free-tail bat, which does not live here in Washington, but does live in the United States, has been shown to fly up to 100 miles an hour on powered flights, so not a dive, not gravity, but actually propelling itself through the air that quickly is a pretty cool thing to remember about bats. So just to kind of show you how that hand wing really works within a bat's wing, this is a video from a rehab facility in Australia. This is not a bat we have locally. It's a little bit bigger, but it's big so that you can really see those hands and wings in there. So as they flap, you can kind of see how that wrist and thumb and fingers work within the wing and allow them to pull themselves through the air when they're out there, which is pretty cool. We'll watch it one more time because I feel like it always goes by way too fast. Maybe. There we go. Yeah. You can kind of see, even just in this bat stationary, how that can work in real flight, and we'll watch it all put together in a little bit as we learn a little bit more about our bats. So bats are a very old animal. The oldest bat fossil is 52.5 million years old, which is quite a long time ago. And there's a lot we don't know about bat evolution. We don't have great fossil records of bats because they're flying mammals, are only flying mammals. Their bones, while not hollow like birds, are still quite small and delicate, so that they can stay light and able to fly, which makes them really hard to preserve in fossil state. So we have very few of them. But the ones we do have, the most recent and longest back into history, were found in modern day Wyoming. These two bats here are Icarana-ceratus and the Onychonicorus. Were both found, one in 1966, the other in 2008. And they were complete skeletons that were already very similar to our modern flying bats. The most recent one, found in 2008, did show a little bit of differences. So our first skeleton that we looked at with our bat, when we were learning about Chiroptera, had slightly longer upper arms and slightly shorter hind limbs. Bats are a little different than us in that their arms are longer than their legs, which allows them enough wing space to fly. This bat was a little bit different in that they were a little bit more equal, but you could kind of see that they were progressing from normal land-based mammals into something that would be able to fly, and this bat could fly. It kind of was we're still trying to learn whether flight came before some of their sound abilities and their ability to see in the dark, called echolocation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But in this most recent find, they are starting to believe that flight evolved before echolocation, but there's still a lot of records from fossils missing, because we know that bats are much older than the fossils we found, because these guys are already full flight flying animals that greatly resemble our local bat, our recent bats, our current bats. But we're still kind of figuring that out. This was already a pretty small bat at 5.5 inches, which is pretty size closer to what we have in living bats today. If you're thinking like some of the animals that used to be a lot bigger. But there's still a lot to learn, and it's really interesting to see how this kind of works. So we know they've been around a really long time, and that's kind of allowed them to spread as far around the globe as they have and fill all of these different ecological niches. So when we're looking at our bats, there's a few things that we want to learn about just kind of the biology of bats. So often there's this saying that, you know, blind as a bat, and people think that maybe bats don't use eyesight to see because they're able to fly in the dark. The reality is that they actually all have very good eyesight, at least as almost as good as human eyesight. But even so, that's not really enough to let you go out and hunt insects in the dead of night. So if someone sent me out at midnight without a flashlight to go catch a bunch of mosquitoes, I would fail miserably. And so a lot of bats, although not all bats, have developed echolocation. So what they do is they use sound similar to sonar, but much more complex, to find their way around in the dark and to hunt night flying insects. And so echolocation is generally something in the ultrasonic range. So most bats echolocate above human hearing, which is actually really good for us, because if we could hear them, it's a very loud sound that would make our peaceful nights outside much less peaceful. It'd be equivalent to sitting under a fire alarm in school all night as they fly around and catch their prey. So I'm fine with the fact that I can't hear them, but human hearing goes up to about 15 to 20 kilohertz on a really good day. And the majority of bats start echolocating at 20 kilohertz and can produce sounds, depending on the species, as high as 120 kilohertz. So it's a very high-pitched sound that they're able to use to navigate, identify where they are, hunt prey. Some bats, like our flying foxes, those bigger fruit bats we were looking at earlier, that can grow to be 3, 4, 5 foot wingspans, many of those do not echolocate anymore. The belief is that they've kind of developed a body size that is too big to support the mechanics needed to produce those sounds and listen to those echoes. So you can kind of see in this picture on the left that flying fox has much larger eyes and much smaller ears. So the eyes and the long snout allow them to see in dim light and use their sense of smell to find their fruit. They may also be more active in early evening hours or late dawn hours when there's more light available. And because of their big size, they have a little less fear of predators, so they're more likely to move in those brighter times of day. Whereas our smaller bats, almost all of who echolocate, even the ones that don't just eat insects, use that for navigation, and then they have special parts of their ears. You can kind of see in this extremely large eared bat, the spotted bat. At the very front of his ear, he's got an extra flap of skin called a tragus, and that's going to help him with his echolocation. So depending on the bat, their size of their ears, the shape of their faces, echolocation can look a lot different for a lot of different species. But even bats that don't prey on insects that have echolocation are using that to navigate and find their way around in the dark, which is pretty cool. So there's a myth that bats will fly in your hair. We kind of believe that myth may have been started by a parent who wanted their kids in before dark, trying to put a little fear of them. But of course, this isn't true. That echolocation is incredibly sophisticated. Some of the bat species are complex enough that they'd be able to see the individual hairs on your head, so they're never going to be looking to get involved with us if they can help it. We're big and scary, they're small and quick. So the chances of them flying into your hair are very, very small because they are able to see where they're going and what they want to do. So they use this echolocation in 3 phases. Most bats, especially the ones that are hunting night flying insects, which is the majority of our bat species and all of our species here in Washington, are going to use those calls in 3 ways. So the first one is their navigation calls. Those are going to be consistent calls that they make as they're flying. And their echolocation is actually tied to their breath. As they raise their wings up and breathe in, as they lower their wings, they kind of create a shout, usually through their voice box, that bounces back and gives them information about what's going on around them. So the slower calls are going to be helping them see where the buildings, the trees are, what's on the horizon, where they're going. When they are starting to hunt or forage, those calls are gonna pick up as they're looking to identify prey. And then as they hone in on that prey and actually capture the prey, it's gonna get even quicker to a point where to a human ear, it's gonna be indistinguishable sounds that really sound like a buzz. So we call that a feeding buzz. It's a very interesting system. So I'm gonna show you guys a video of how all this comes together. You can see really well in this video, this is one of our smaller insect-eating species from the Western United States. You can see how their hand wings work, how they use those wings not only to fly, but even to capture prey like a baseball glove. They also have a tail membrane that they have extra bones off their ankles that allow them to control that tail membrane and use it in capture, which we'll see here. And then you'll also be able to hear the echolocation calls and the differences between coming in and honing in on insects and capturing insects. So I'm gonna play that. If you're not hearing it well, let's turn up your speakers. It may be a little quieter than I am, but it's up as high as I can get. Capture. I really like this video. I think it gives us a great or better understanding of how bats really hunt. Obviously, this is slowed down quite a bit, both in speed of the hunt and the echolocation calls. I'm not exactly sure what magnitude this is slowed down, but if you've ever watched bats out at night, you know that they're very quick and we would miss all of this. But it's great to be able to see how they use those hand wings, not only to fly and navigate, to capture, to keep themselves moving while they capture. You also see they don't have a full success rate, and they're certainly not catching things right in their mouth and just chowing them down. It's a pretty intricate process of capture and hold and transfer into their mouth, which is pretty cool. You may have noticed at one point the bat actually spit that moth out. That moth might not have tasted very good. That does definitely happen. There's a very interesting history of evolution between moths and bats in terms of their predator-prey dynamic, in terms of moths as insects developing ears due to echolocation. That soft, fuzzy surface that their wings and their bodies have is thought to be a direct result of trying to dampen echolocation calls from bats, which are one of their main predators, and a whole slew of other things that they've developed just to evade predation by bats over the millions of years. Is really quite fascinating. All right, why do bats hang upside down? This is a great question. The why and then the how are both really interesting with bats. So in terms of the why, that's definitely to stay safe when sleeping during the day, when a lot of predators are out. Being high up, especially on a ceiling, but also on a wall type area of a cave or a building or anything they can find, is much less accessible to predators. But the other piece of that puzzle is that bats do not have the same lift that birds do in terms of taking flight. And most species actually cannot take off from the ground. So if a bat is on the ground, they need to find something to climb to get enough height that when they do drop down, they get a little bit of help from gravity on their initial swoop. before they can fly away. So by hanging upside down, by sleeping upside down, they're always ready to take off instead of having to expend energy or time climbing something in order to then take off. The way that works for them is bats' skeleton is slightly different than ours, even when it kind of looks similar. The pelvis is fused together instead of ours, which is actually separated in 3 pieces. And the hind or the lower leg bones that protrude from the pelvis actually protrude on the back side of that pelvis, so that their feet actually face the opposite direction from us, which means that they can't really get up on hands and knees and crawl away when they're on the ground, with the exception of a few species. But it enables them to hang upside down. And then they have special tendons in their ankles so that when their claws are starting to grip, the weight of the bat actually pulls that grip closed, and keeps it closed until the bat kind of consciously releases it. And so once they're hanging, it's their body weight is keeping them gripped to whatever surface they're on. So if they fall asleep, if they're unconscious, they're not going to fall off of that space, and they're not using any energy in that grip. It's kind of a zero energy position for them, whereas that would take us a lot of energy and a lot of effort to hang on to something for an extended period of time. So they can stay upside down hanging for a very long time. So that allows them to do that. They also have a larger heart and blood and arteries and veins that work slightly different than us, so that they never get that kind of rush of blood to the head. It's moving through a much bigger space, and it's specially set up so that our blood can't pool in their heads. Lucky bats. So how do bats benefit us around the world? What ecosystem services do they provide? So what things do they do for our environment that are beneficial for us and for the world? And so the number one is pest control. 2/3 of all of those species of bats we were talking about are insectivores and prey mainly on insects. So they are the number one predator of night flying insects, and that can be anything from insects that spread bloodborne pathogens like mosquitoes to agricultural pests and the things that eat our foods. So they save farmers in the US alone up to $3 to $4 billion in pest control services every year. There are new studies coming out that are showing that bats are responsible for increasing farmers' yield by up to 1/3 of their crop products. That's been shown in Southwest United States and in Mexico with corn and farm and rice, and I'm sure we're going to find that that's true with other things. So they really are a number one form of natural pest control, and they make it so that we have to use a lot less pesticides on our food, our gardens stay safer, and we get a lot more food out of what is being produced, which is pretty fantastic and really important. And then, of course, they just make it way better for us to be outside at night, especially in the summer, by eating all of the smaller gnats and mosquitoes and flies and little things that we don't want bugging us when we're having a nice evening outside. So bats kind of do that in 2 different ways. We always think, of course, like in our video about our aerial hawking bats, that would be bats that are catching night flying insects. But we also have several species of bats that either do both or what we call gleaners. So they use their echolocation a little differently. Either they don't use it all of the time when they're hunting, or they can actually point it at the ground to identify insects and then use their really large ears, which are not just for echolocation, but can actually hear footsteps of insects on the ground. And so some bat species, including some here in Washington and several in the United States, are what we would call gleaners. So they'll pick insects up off the ground or off the back of leaves or off sticks and branches and eat them that way as well. So they're not just eating our flying insects. They get a lot of variety in their diets. The other thing that bats do around the world, not here in Washington, but we have some pollinating bats down in the Southwest United States and in lots of our tropical zone areas. Pollinating bats are responsible for pollinating more than 500 different plants, foods, and flowers. They're responsible for a ton of foods that we really rely on, like bananas and agave that makes tequila would not be pollinated without wild bats. It's a really important service. It's often overlooked. There's a lot of foods that they have a large part in pollinating. They're especially important not only in the tropical regions where they do a lot of pollination, but in desert habitats where a lot of our biggest plants don't bloom their flowers during the day because of the water loss due to evaporation. Instead, they'll bloom their flowers, if you're thinking about the really big 20, 30-foot cactuses that you see in desert habitats, they in particular will bloom their flowers at night, and they'll have big white blooms that reflect moonlight. And those are mainly pollinated by bats. And it's a very important service that they provide. Bats are much better at pollinating large numbers of plants over wide areas than a lot of insects are. So even with our nocturnal pollinating insects in the deserts, kind of the diversity that is gained by bat pollination is much higher, and it makes those plants a lot less resilient in one of the most kind of extreme habitats we have around the world. So, so another video for you. This is actually just kind of a fun thing that a lot of people don't know about. Since we do have pollinating bats, we recently, well, recent might be a while back now, but we've discovered that they have also learned to utilize our hummingbird feeders, just like our hummingbirds. There was a study from the University of Arizona out in Tucson, where they actually were getting complaints and information from locals saying that they would fill their hummingbird feeders up at night, come back in the morning, and they would be too empty for the hummingbirds who hadn't even showed up yet. And it turned out that those hummingbird feeders are being utilized by bats. This was also a time where the bats' natural food source, which is kind of agave on their migration trail, was greatly reduced, and the bats were kind of finding another way around that. So this still happens in Arizona and all the way down into the tropics, where bats have figured out hummingbird feeders. And this is also very slowed down because, as you learn, anything bats do, they do quickly. But it's very cool to see how they utilize it, and you can even see the length of that tongue as they come back out from this. And I'll play it again. Play it one more time. This is, we have in the United States, we have lesser long-nosed bats and Mexican long-tongued bats. But there is a bat in another part of the world that has a tongue that is 1.5 times the length of its body. It actually has to store it in a separate cavity because it is such a long tongue, but they, in particular, the tube-lipped bat, that's what I think is on here. Yep, the tube-lipped nectar bat feeds on really long tubed flowers, and they can reach all the way down to the bottom and get all of that nectar, which is pretty cool. All right, so the last group I was going to talk about is our fruit-eating bats. So we talked about flying foxes not having echolocation, being very large bats that mostly eat fruit. They can also eat some pollen and nectar and twigs and berries and other things that they find. But we also have fruit bats that are smaller bats that do still use echolocation, but eat fruit as well. So we can kind of say that like a flying fox is usually a fruit bat, but you can't really say that a fruit bat is always a flying fox. So there are smaller bats. The flying fox, the larger bats, are found in kind of our, what we refer to as our old world continents. So that would be Asia, Africa, and Australia. Here in the Americas, we have smaller fruit-eating bats, but we don't have any in the United States. I think Mexico is as far north as they have come at this point. So you'll mostly find them in those neotropical zones where there's a lot of diversity and a lot of fruit. And those smaller bats. So most fruit bats can eat about 2 times their weight in fruit every night, which is quite a lot. And so they are really important for seed dispersal, especially in places that have been devastated by flood or fire or human destruction, and there aren't plant species there. One of the reasons for that is fruit bats will often eat their fruit in flight. And being sometimes bigger bats, they cover really long distances. And have fewer predators in the night. So they will fly over those kind of clear-cut, cleared areas where no plants are yet growing. And as they eat while they fly, they actually use really strong jaw muscles to kind of press the fruit, using their tongue to press it against the top of their mouth. They'll drink all the juices and nutrients and spit out the pulp and seeds as they fly. And they'll end up planting what we call pioneer plants. So the first plants to grow in an area where nothing is growing, because a lot of the other fruit-eating animals, if they don't fly, they'll be eating the fruit at the tree that they got it from. They drop a lot of the seeds right under the tree. And if it's a smaller animal, it won't feel safe going over those clear areas for fear of predators. Whereas the bats don't have that same fear. They pass through really quickly. They drop whatever they happen to be eating along the way. And so in certain areas where fruit bats are common, they can be responsible for up to 95% of those pioneer plants, those first things to grow that allow everything else to grow around them. So that's very cool and very important for our bats. So before we get into Washington, there are a few other things that bats eat that are pretty cool. So while these are the majority, there are, especially in Central America, fish-eating bats, and in South America, frog-eating bats. We have a few species of carnivorous bats that eat a little bit of everything, from birds to other bats to small mammals to all sorts of stuff. And then, of course, out of the 1,469 species of bats we have on Earth, we do have 3 species of vampire bats that feed primarily on blood. That blood is usually, for 2 of those species, that blood comes from birds. And the last species, the common vampire bat, does feed on mammals. Historically, that was very large wildlife, things like tapirs or fur seals or other animals that occurred in their area. Vampire bats also only live in Central and South America. They're not found on any other continents on Earth. They just live in that one spot. So they're very interesting. These days, since people have brought in developments and livestock, our common vampire bat has switched a lot of its diet to livestock, very large animals that are very easy to access. But with all of our vampire bats, their goal is not to kill their prey. It's actually to create a really small, almost paper cut like injury on the animal into somewhere they're not going to notice, because they're often feeding off things that are much, much bigger than them. And they take just a teaspoon of blood a night. And they do that by using a naturally occurring anticoagulant that is in their saliva to get a little bit of blood flow from that animal. And then they kind of lap it up more like a cat would with milk. In fact, vampire bats don't really have big canine teeth that we associate with vampires and fangs at all. Other bat species do, but they have less of that, and they use their front teeth instead to make this little incision and to get what they need and leave, with hopes that they can come back and feed again the next day. Bridger, do you have any questions before I switch into Washington species?
I think, yeah, let's keep rolling.
All right, cool. All right, so here in Washington State, we have 14 species of bats. Occasionally you will see in some places it says 15. This is one of those things you learn about bats as you do this for a while. So we have recently found that 2 species that we had classified separately were in fact the same species of bats, and it's going through its official changeover. But at Bats Northwest, we've kind of read enough of the literature to say, yes, we agree. We are going to say 14 species of bats here in Washington. So all of those, except for, I think, all of those bats occur in Eastern Washington. When I do this talk in Western Washington, I have to tell them about the 4 that only you guys have. It is not these 4, but we will talk about all 4 of them. So all of our bats here in Washington are insectivores, eating primarily insects. The largest bat we have in Washington is the hoary bat, which is in the top, well, my right, I guess, I don't know, in the top corner there with a 13 to 16 inch wingspan. So hoary bat all over the state, and is a very cool migratory bat. And you can kind of tell that looking at all these different bats. You can see how wings are a little different on all species. So the hoary bat has very long, skinny wings, which allows it to fly much faster and for much greater distances, meaning that it can migrate in the winter, and it does. We don't know exactly where all of our hoary bats go, but we know that they've gone as far south as Southern California and even into Mexico before returning to our area in the summer. So this bat is a really solitary bat that lives most often in trees. It's actually, even in its when it's having its babies, the female bats do that by themselves. Bats here are not monogamous, and so our male bats do not have any part in birthing and raising young. But this hoary bat can have what's actually a fair number of babies for a bat in our area. Most of our bats have just 1 pup a year. Hoary bats can have up to 2 or 3 or even 4 in unusual circumstances. And that's because they're raising them by themselves in those trees. And so they get their name from the hoary bats get their name from their fur. They're our most densely furred bat in Washington. You can kind of see even in this picture the little bit of lion's mane we have going on there. But it gets its name from those white tips that are on the outside of that fur. And so this fur is great camouflage for them, whether they're blending into the bark of a tree that they're on, or if they're wrapping their wings up around them, hanging from a tall limb on that tree and disguising themselves as a dried up leaf during the day, which they do quite effectively. The other bat there on the top is our smallest bat in Washington. It's also the smallest bat in the United States, called a canyon bat. It occurs just in eastern Washington, in Washington state. And it's kind of got the opposite wing pattern to our hoary bat. It's got much shorter, much stubbier wings, much thicker wings, and that allows it to be very maneuverable. It flies a lot slower, but it can make really quick turns and work its way through much more dense areas. In fact, this bat is so small that occasionally when you're outside, if you do see it at night, it often looks like a large moth because it's moving really slowly and it's quite small. You don't expect it to be a bat. It's also one of the earliest bats to emerge before sunset. It's much more commonly seen in kind of that sunset full light area where it'll come out and forage early and then go back and usually take a nap before it comes back out for the night. Insectivore bats have to eat a ton of food to keep up with the energy needed for flight. So most bats eat between about 30 and 50% of their body weight each night in insects. So as you can imagine, that takes a lot of insects. And so they have very fast digestions, and most bats will emerge and come out at night, fill their stomachs, and then go somewhere to sleep. So they can kind of digest, do their thing, go back out and do that several times during the night to get enough energy and nutrients to maintain their flight. Flight takes a lot of energy. It's kind of like if we ran a marathon every single day. Just imagine the number of dinners you'd have to keep that up. So a couple other local species, spotted bats are also an eastern Washington species. They're found in very few places. They're incredibly rare, very cool bats, but they do occur in Methow Valley. It's one of the places we know that they are living. There's a lot we don't know about them because they're very rare, very solitary, and very hard to study. We do know that they like to live in really tall, sheer cliff faces and crevices and rocks. We don't even really know if they hibernate or migrate during the winter. We're not entirely sure. But they're a very cool species that we hope to learn more about. And we're going to talk about some ways that you guys can even help if you want to help researchers figure out where these guys are living and where their habitats really are. They're also the only bat we have in Washington, and one of the few in the United States that echolocate in a range that we can hear. So unlike most bats, their echolocation starts down around 8 kilohertz, which is right in almost everyone's range of hearing. And so while they're really rare, there are ways that you can learn to listen for them in certain areas and identify them when they fly by based on their echolocation calls, which is really cool. They sound a little bit like a cricket, but much more methodical in their calls. And we'll talk about them a little bit more when we talk about community science. So little brown bats, on the other hand, are found all across the United States, or yes, all across the United States, but also all across the state of Washington. They're very common, very adaptable bats. We would call them a generalist in that they're really able to adapt to a lot of different roost locations, food availability, noise and disturbances, and are very commonly found in urban, suburban, and rural areas. They're a smaller bat. They're part of what we call the Myotis bats, which we have 4 or 5 of, which are kind of a grouping of bat species, a family of bats. And so little brown bats are bigger than our canyon bats, but pretty small, pretty quick flyers. They specialize in smaller insects, pretty commonly found around water sources, eating aquatic insects, versus our spotted bat, for instance, who likes to hunt over open meadows and is more looking for bigger insects like moths, or even our hoary bats who like to fly above the treetops again to hunt for bigger insects. So our bigger bats tend to have less complex echolocation calls, so that they need to forage in much more open areas, so that when those echolocation calls do come back, while they travel a really long distance, because lower sounds tend to travel further, when they bounce back, they want to know that that is something that they're hunting for, and they don't want as much clutter. Whereas our smaller bats, like the little brown bat, have much more sophisticated or complex echolocation that can allow them to hunt in more cluttered areas around other vegetation, in more open forests or forest edges. So that's a few of our 14. We have a lot of information on the Bats Northwest website. If you guys want to look through the details of all 14 species, I'll give you guys that link at the end. But we have a lot of detail on where they occur and where they like to live and what their habitat is like across the state. The last one I wanted to talk about is also an Eastern Washington species that you guys have in that area. And this is one of my favorite bats because they're extremely cool. Pallid bats are one of our biggest bats. They're second biggest after the hoary bat. But still, that's only about a wingspan of 14 to 15 inches, which is really not that big. But the cool thing about pallid bats is they're one of those gleaning bats that we were talking about. So not only do they hunt night-flying insects with their echolocation, but they hunt insects off the ground. And they tend to occur in most of our desert habitat, shrub steppe, more arid locations, all the way starting up in Canada down through Mexico. And pallid bats are great because they use their big ears to listen for footsteps of insects on the ground. And they're also one of our few bat species that can land and even stalk insects on the ground and take off again, unlike the other ones that aren't quite as capable on the ground. And so they specialize, they have a special resistance to the venom of scorpions and centipedes. And so they're actually able to capture those insects and take them back to their roost to eat. And it's very, very cool how they're able to do that. Yeah. So where do bats in Washington live? A lot of our bats live in trees. We have a lot of bats who specialize in living within trees, like the hoary bats, but tree cavities and rock crevices are very common, as are our bridges in terms of man-made buildings that bats like to utilize. Bats, when they're looking for a roost, they have a few different uses for roosts. So the one we think of most is what we call a day roost. So where do they sleep during the day when they're active at night? And so that's obviously very important. And we'll talk a little bit about how female bats and maternity colonies form. But here in Washington, outside of our maternity colonies, we don't have very many other bat colonies. A lot of our bats live in small groups or even solitary, if they are males or if they are non-reproductive females. And so those bats are looking for places that they can stay safe from predators, that they can keep their body temperature consistent. So bats are very energy conscious, as we talked about, with how much food they have to eat. Thermoregulation, or regulating their body heat, is another way that they preserve energy. So if you think about the difference of using just your body heat to heat up a sleeping bag versus heat up a room, bats are kind of thinking that same way. So they're looking for crevices or cavities that they can get into and keep warm and keep safe from predators. Nothing can follow them in. So a lot of times, and this kind of plays into what we'll talk about a little bit with bat houses, is those crevices can be from about 1/2 inch to 1 1/4 inch in size, which is about the size of our bats when they're all curled up with their wings in. So they'll want something they can crawl into, turn around so they can face out and see, be ready to take off, but nothing can really follow in after them. And then if they are in a smaller group, they'll look for a bigger space, but a lot of those same things still apply. And so that's why things like bridges with really narrow openings and cement are great. Bark, underbark, hollows made by other animals, and then our rock crevices where there are cliff sides. And even as we get into higher elevations, we have bats that will utilize rock fields that you'll see up in alpine areas and hide under and in those small places as well. So the other types of roosts that bats will use, though, they do utilize night roosts. So we talked about how they'll come out, forage for a while, fill up their stomach, and need to go find somewhere to kind of digest that food. So they'll often find somewhere they can roost for 1 hour or 2 hours closer to their foraging ground. So sometimes that's a natural spot, sometimes that's a man-made spot. And then we also have not only our maternity colonies, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but what we kind of call transition roosts. So all of our bats in Washington are going to move from summer areas to winter areas in some form. It might be a short distance, it might be a long distance, but there's a lot of movement from bats, especially in the spring and the fall. And so they'll use roosts as they're moving from area to area. So they may roost somewhere for just a few nights and move on. A lot of our solitary bats will switch roosts even throughout the summer, every 3 to 5 days, depending on the species, while others will pick a summer night or a day roost and stick with it their entire season. So there's a lot of variation. And so if a bat shows up someplace just for a couple of days, especially in the spring and fall, but even in the summer, that may be okay. They may just be moving through to one place or another. It fit their criteria for that moment, and they'll probably find another spot before too long. All right, so water, of course, is really important to bats. We haven't talked about water too much yet. So since all of our bats are insectivores, they're not really getting hydration from their food. Insects are dry and crunchy. So we did talk about bats being pretty vulnerable on the ground with a couple of exceptions. And what that ends up meaning for bats is when they do go out and look for water, because of course they're mammals, they need water just like all of us. It's an essential part of their life. But they need very different water sources than a lot of other animals. They can't land on the ground to use a puddle. They're not going to utilize a bird bath. They're going to need a large fresh water source that they can do what we call drinking on the wing. So they're going to fly down, get a mouthful of that water, and need to fly out again without encountering any obstacles. And so that's become a really important thing as our climate changes, as development continues through natural areas, of bats being able to still find somewhere where they can get the hydration they need. So oftentimes, especially if you want to go out and look for bats, a great way to do that is to start with a fresh water source, because many bats, when they first emerge in the evening, are going to head for that spot to get water. And then we also have a lot of bats in the state that utilize water sources for aquatic insects. So it's always a great place to go look for bats, but it's also a really important part of their habitat that we can help, not only keeping fresh water clean by not polluting, but also keeping those fresh water sources available and thinking about some of these species that have to have them when we're making changes to the environment. The other part I will add on here that I forgot, as especially in kind of our shrub steppe and more arid habitats, not only water, but the zones around water. So those places that we call riparian areas, that's anywhere that's growing around water sources, are really essential for bats, especially those smaller species that rely on the insects that are more common around water areas and around the plants that grow near water. Those can be really important foraging grounds for bat species, especially on the east side of the state where they're a little bit less frequent, but still really important ecosystems. Yeah, so a year in the life of a Washington bat. So in Washington state, our bats usually become active in the early to late spring. Definitely depends on the year we're having and the weather we're having. It's been very variable over the last few years. But in April or March or April, you're going to start seeing bats reemerge. They're following, of course, insects. They need the food. So when our insects come back in the spring, that's when you can kind of expect to start seeing our bats again. In that kind of late spring, early summer, any of the females who are pregnant and going to be having pups, which is what we call our bat babies, are going to actually find each other and form what we call a maternity colony. So often these maternity colonies are used in the same place year after year after year. So the bats are returning to something they know, maybe some new younger females joining for the first time. But those maternity colonies, they're pretty loyal to those roosts and will return every year to have their pups. And so what they're looking for is a really warm, protected spot where they can all fit together. Here in Washington, we don't get the kind of colonies that you hear about in, the southern United States or other parts of the world, where you're going to have millions of bats living in the same cave or under a bridge or something like that. Here in Washington, a large colony for us is more like a few hundred, maybe 1,000 bats in one spot. But they still like to get together. So it's kind of a safety in numbers, where that number of bats can kind of help protect the nursery, protect their babies, protect each other. But it's also a source of warmth. So bats to kind of gestate really quickly, and those babies also have to grow really quickly. So most bats have about one baby a year. This is contrary to what a lot of people think, because we do relate bats to rodents so often that we think their life cycle is very similar. Rodents will have litters multiple times during a year. They live a short life. Bats are actually the longest lived mammal for their size on Earth. They actually will live, depending on the species, in the wild between 15 to 25 years. So they really do have a very different life than you would equate with other small animals. And so that annual pup that they have is really important to their population numbers. They do not reproduce quickly. They do not replace themselves quickly. And so when they're trying to develop their babies, they're going to find somewhere very warm, because that's going to aid not only in their gestation, but after those pups are born, it's going to aid in their ability to focus their energy on growing up really fast. So for most bat species, those babies are flying around between 4 to 7 weeks, usually closer to 4. And in between, at least here in Washington, our moms don't carry their pups around very often, with the exception of our bats that don't form maternity colonies, like the hoary bat I mentioned. They're going to leave their pup behind when they go out and forage every night. And now that they're a pregnant or nursing mother, they're not trying to eat 50% of their body weight a night. They're trying to eat almost 100% of their body weight every night. So those moms are busy. They're really busy. And then once our pups are able to fly, usually within that 4 to 6 week period, they're going to go out foraging with their moms. They're going to learn from them. They're going to stay with them into the fall. All of the pups are flying. Those maternity colonies usually disperse, and mom and their pup will head off on their own for the remainder of the summer, when they're starting to build up their food stores. And then if they're one of our hibernating bats, they will head into the fall towards their hibernation area. Depending on the species, they hibernate in different places. There's a lot we don't know about Washington bats and where they hibernate, because they're much more solitary and form much smaller groups even to hibernate than in some places on the East Coast or in the South of the United States. So they can be very hard to track and very hard to find. But we do know that in the fall, they'll head out looking for the place where they're going to hibernate. There are some studies that even show that the bats will check out multiple locations. This is the same point that our bats will mate. So kind of as they are looking for those hibernation spots and eating as much as they possibly can to put on weight, yet still be able to fly. So it's not like bear season, a little different. They will also do what we call swarming, which is when they will mate. And then the interesting thing about our bats is once they mate, they don't actually become pregnant until the following spring, when the proper conditions are met in terms of the right temperatures and enough food. So they have what we call delayed impregnation, which is similar in bears and a couple other mammals, where they'll kind of like store that and wait until a much later time to start that gestation period. So in the winter, here in Washington, we have both migratory bats and hibernating bats. So our migratory bats are mostly our hoary bat and our silver-haired bats. So they will migrate. There's a lot we don't know about migration within our bats, but we're starting to learn more and more. We do know that some of the Eastern Washington and British Columbia silver-haired bats actually migrate into the Puget Sound lowlands for the winter. So they're not going that far. They're coming to hang out with us in Seattle. But then we also have species that go much further south to where there's more insect activity. Our other bat species, most of them we think hibernate through the winter. Some of them we know do. And so they may, when they're hibernating through the winter, again, this is an energy saving activity. Here in Washington, when it gets cold, our insect populations drop a lot. So they're not going to have the food they need to be able to continue to be active. And so hibernation is going to allow them to lower their metabolic rate, meaning their breathing, their heart rate, their bodily functions drop way, way, way down, and allow them to survive through the winter, basically sleeping with short periods of arousal when they wake up throughout the winter until those insects return and they can go out and feed again. So while we don't know where all of them go, we do know that some seem to move into maybe the foothills of the Cascades and other mountain ranges. They're looking for a place that the temperature is going to be consistent throughout the year, because while they can drop their body temperature and all of their bodily functions, they don't want to drop them past freezing, because they will freeze to death. And they don't want big fluctuations, because their body temperature is basically going to match the ambient temperature. And if that shifts too much, it can change the energy level they're using. And if it doesn't all work out, they cannot, they won't make it through the winter properly. So they're generally looking for somewhere that is going to be just above freezing and consistent that whole time period. So basically somewhere insulated, like a cave or a mine, though we don't have many of those. We do know some of our bats will hibernate under bridges. Others may use tree hollows or rock crevices, and we just don't know. there's just a lot we don't know. So moving on, rabies is always an important thing to talk about with bats. There's a lot of fear and unknown around it. The truth is that most bats do not have rabies. It's less than 1% of all populations. That being said, they are the only known vector of rabies in Washington state. So we do not ever want people handling bats with a bare hand. They are small, they are fuzzy, they can be cute, don't pick them up. If they do need help, make sure it's an adult and make sure it's someone with thick gloves or some sort of implement that they don't need to come in contact with that bat. If you were to ever accidentally or otherwise encounter a bat, they certainly are terrified of us as we're huge and they're small. They're wild animals. They will bite to defend themselves. So if you did ever get bit or scratched by a bat, go seek medical attention ASAP. Rabies is not something to mess around with, but it is something that is easily treated. The scary stories of how terrible bat rabies shots are no longer true. It's like getting a flu shot. So it's definitely worthwhile. One of the biggest things that's come up with rabies with bats is actually household pets. Keeping pets like dogs and cats in particular up on their rabies shots is one of the best things you can do to help our bats and just to help everybody. Because that if someone finds a bat and it is sick, it's most likely going to be a pet before a person. And that can cause a lot of big problems. Bats do die from rabies the same as everything else. They don't carry it just to transmit it. They get sick and die within about 10 days. Bats can be seen flying during the day and can be found on the ground. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are rabid. There's lots of reasons bats are out flying during the day, particularly during migration seasons or right after our juveniles learn to fly. That being said, finding a bat on the ground certainly increases the likelihood that it is sick. So you do want to treat it carefully and either get help, or if you do feel like it's just stuck on the ground, because we know they can't really fly from the ground, you can find a safe way to place it up high on a bush or a tree limb to see if it can fly on its own before calling Fish and Wildlife or Bats Northwest or a local rehab facility. All right, so threats to bats in Washington state. They're wild animals. They're facing all the same things that other wildlife is in terms of habitat destruction and finding good roost sites with all the human development. That's certainly a concern. There's also a global decline in insects happening that is very impactful to bats, as 2/3 of our world species rely on insects for their food. But a really important one that you've probably heard in the news for the last 15 years is white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus. And that fungus, we believe, was probably brought into the United States from Europe, where this has occurred before, but European bats have a naturally developed immunity to this fungus. Here in the United States, our bats do not have that immunity. So when it first arrived in New York in 2006, and what it does is it attacks hibernating bats. So this fungus likes to thrive in the exact same conditions that our hibernating bats are looking for to make their hibernation work properly. So they need to find that consistently cool, certain temperature so that their hibernation stays consistent, lets them last through the winter. And this fungus happened to thrive in that area. So while the bats were hibernating in these usually caves on the East Coast, this fungus would get onto the bat, like shown in this picture. It would spread across the non-furred surfaces. So that can be wings and ears and muzzles. And a couple of things would happen. One is it could wake that bat up because it's basically like a skin rash, and it will itch and impede them. If it gets into the respiratory system, it can make it harder for them to breathe. So it'll wake them up, and they'll spend a bunch of time and energy grooming it off of them before going back into their hibernation state. Now, if they have to do that enough times in a winter, they're going to use up their fat stores long before the insects arrive back to the area. So essentially, they would starve to death. The other thing that could happen is it could actually get to their wings to a point where it would make it so they can no longer fly. So then when they did wake up and needed to go out and feed, they weren't able to fly. So due to this, white nose has caused the death of about 5 to 7 million bats on the East Coast already. It's been devastating to some of our bat species, particularly some of the smaller bat species. and caused almost a 90% mortality rate in some areas. So it arrived here in Washington State in 2016. It was first discovered in North Bend. We're not entirely sure how it jumped this far out west. Maybe we just hadn't discovered its path yet. But the interesting thing about Washington is because we don't have these really large cave systems, we don't have these really large colonies, it's been a lot harder to track the impact of white nose. So we know that it's here, it's spread to a number of our counties. We've definitely had bat fatalities from it, but because we don't know enough about where our bats hibernate, it's very hard to track the actual impact. So one of the things that we ask of the public is that if you do have a bat colony that you know of, you know where the roost is, whether it's during the winter when they're hibernating or in the summer, that you can report those colonies to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on their website. And it allows them to better study what's going on with all of our bats. So that's a really helpful thing to do. There are a couple of studies that are happening in Washington State every summer right now, trying to find not really solutions, but help for white nose syndrome. There's 2 separate studies going on with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, USGS, and a number of partners. One is looking at kind of a probiotic that can be applied to roosts to make sure that the fungus that causes white nose isn't being passed between summer and winter roosts and spreading each winter. The other is more of an oral vaccine for bats. Both of those are definitely in early stages. It would be great to see if we could do something. Because our populations are in smaller groups, we have different options that aren't as available to the East Coast, because obviously they can't like orally vaccinate 2 million bats in a cave, but we might be able to do something along those lines for 300 in a colony. So there's a lot going on. Awareness is just a really big piece of it, understanding what's going on, staying out of caves when bats are hibernating. If you ever find bats in the winter, leave them alone. They need all the energy they have to make it through the winter and try and survive this thing, because if they do make it through the winter and are able to go out and feed, a lot of bats will survive white nose if it hasn't killed them by that point, because then they're awake, they can replenish their energy supplies, they can groom it off of themselves, and hopefully survive the ordeal. And then, yeah, so white nose is one thing. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. The other is a little sad, but not terribly surprising. Our wind turbines are causing a very large issue for our migratory bats. So we've got our hibernating bats dealing with white nose. We have our migratory bats dealing with wind turbines. A lot of our migratory bats are bats that use tall trees on the horizon to navigate. And they're migrating through these areas that are now populated by wind turbines. They're being struck by wind turbines at a pretty high rate across the United States. I think the studies are showing right now it's about 500,000 bats a year. That's a lot. It doesn't sound catastrophic unless you also take into consideration that the United States is on track to increase our wind turbines and wind energy by about 500%. And if that was to happen, that would be a pretty big deal. So it's very difficult. Impacts from wind turbines are very different depending on the species and the region and the area. We haven't found like one full solution of painting them a certain color or doing something or putting out acoustic deterrence that works. The only thing that seems to work is an awareness of migration times and a mitigation of when the turbines are on and off during that time of year. So there's a lot of work being done around this. Public opinion is really important. Just the understanding, like birds, the bats are being impacted this big. At one point, our hoary bat was actually on track to go extinct in the state because of this. We're hoping that that is mitigated a bit before that happens. But it's a long road ahead and a very slow moving machine to get the attention and results that we need to protect our bats. So, Bridger, that's my next pause point. If you have anything for me. Otherwise, we will talk about coexistence, my favorite.
Well, there's one question that came through just now that says, have trackers been used on bats to identify their roosting and hibernating locations?
Yes, a little bit, but it's kind of an individual bat and an individual hibernacula when we do that. I know that in some places it is being used for that. In Washington, it's being used occasionally. I don't think there's been kind of effort or funding around a full scale effect for that. But because they roost so their hibernation spot is called a hibernaculum in the winter. And so they do group up to do that, but they're still not doing it in very big groups. So we could tag one bat in the fall and find one hibernacula, but we're not going to be able to find really big groups. So it hasn't really, I think, been super worthwhile, although I think they have done that in some aspects. I'd have to ask the people who are doing that work exactly how often they're utilizing it. But the trackers don't tend to stay on very long. Bats are actually very clean animals who are better groomed than most of our house cats. So they're not very good at letting us keep those trackers on there. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I was curious, the fact that we don't have these sort of massive hibernaculums, is that what you?
Yeah.
That's a very cool word. The fact that we
Yeah.
don't have these large central locations, does that mean, you said it makes it harder to track white nose? Does it also perhaps bode well for our bats that they're not,
Yeah.
coming together to sort of share that pathogen?
Yes, like that's definitely the hope, is that it won't spread through. And I feel like that's probably what we're seeing, although we just don't really know if it's working out that way or not, because it's so hard to kind of track those population numbers in comparison to what they did in the East Coast. But yeah, we're definitely hopeful that it will be less impactful here because it has fewer individuals to spread through in a given year, and that it's going to be harder for it to spread around to all these different smaller spots. It's also why they're kind of focusing in the summer on, is there ways to make sure that, if it survives on the bat to a summer roost, that it's not then within a summer roost and going back to multiple winter roosts. Because it can definitely be spread by bats that are not necessarily going to be killed by it. Like some of our bigger species have been known as carriers, but they haven't come to it at the same rate. White nose can also be spread by a lot of beings, individuals, species that are not bats, but it only affects and kills hibernating bats. So yeah, it could be good news. It could be good news. We'll see. We'll see. Yeah.
And then let's see, we have a question about bat boxes, which I'm guessing you're maybe about to go into.
Yeah.
But before we move on, you mentioned that the hoary bat was on track for extinction, and there's a question here that I think is related. Are there any Washington bats that are currently on sensitive/endangered species lists?
Yeah, actually, one of the 14 we haven't talked about yet. So the Townsend's big-eared bat is a very specialized bat. It has a very specific habitat that it thrives in, very specific foods that it eats, and it tends to be most attracted to our abandoned mines and caves. We don't have as many caves here in Washington, and our abandoned mines are very prone to disturbance. And as a very sensitive species, it doesn't take a lot for this bat to abandon its roost. So it's on our sensitive species list. I think that we are considering one other species on that list, but that's the only one that's currently listed as a sensitive species in Washington. Yeah. Yeah, they're a bigger bat. They're another one of our gleaning bats that are found across the state. So they're definitely worth looking into. They're fun.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, there are a few others that I think maybe will fit in at the end.
Okay. Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, so coexistence with bats. We've talked about how important they are, how essential they are. Bats can be very safe to have around your area. There isn't any fear from them as aggressive animals, or even with the knowledge of rabies. As long as you are smart and cognizant with wildlife, having bats around is really beneficial. So there are a few things that we can do to help our bats as they try to survive the world at the moment. So the first one I wanted to talk about, and I mentioned earlier, is community science. So there's a lot, as we've talked about, that we don't know about bats here in Washington. And in a lot of places, we don't even have kind of baseline information about how active bats are in different areas across the state. So with our bats only being really active from March or April into October, there's a lot of things around the rest of the year that we may want to do to help benefit bats. But if we don't have information about where they occur and where they don't, that gets really hard. Like if you want to do a conservation project or start a research study, it's nice to kind of know where our bats are, what's going on with them. And so a few years ago, Woodland Park Zoo and Bats Northwest got together to form the Bat Activity Trends Community Science Program as a way to help build awareness of bats in Washington, help people experience observing bats, which can be really fun, and then also start to build some of that baseline information. And the way the Bat Activity Trends work, it's a really simple program that is open from June through September when our bats are kind of at their peak activity. And it just asks people all across the state, anywhere you live, any place you happen to be, to spend 30 minutes at the start of sunset watching for bats overhead or over water, wherever you happen to be. Anywhere you can see kind of an open sky or an open water source. And all they're looking for is activity levels. So we're not counting population, because telling one bat from another as they fly by is really hard. And we're not looking at species yet either, because you can't really tell that observationally from the ground. Our bigger bats tend to fly higher in the sky. The smaller ones fly lower, so they all look exactly the same from below when silhouetted against the sky. But activity can tell us a lot about a habitat. It can tell us a lot about the area the bats are in, if it's something that can support them. Does it have water? Is there food for them to forage? Is it somewhere they feel comfortable passing through or not? And so what we do is we count passes. Every time a bat flies past you, past your line of sight, you count that. And for 30 minutes, at the end of that 30 minutes, you can submit it to the program's website, and that website builds a map of bat observations across the state. And so that can show us, especially year after year, as we look at trends, or even as we look at clusters, what are people seeing? Is somewhere a really great, kind of a really great habitat where there's lots of bat activity around, whether it's one bat flying around in circles all night foraging, it means it's good foraging, or it could be 30 bats passing over once on their way to a nearby water source. But we know that that is working for those animals. Whereas we find an area that has no bat activity consistently, then we can go in and look and say, hey, what's going on here? What's missing? What could we add? What could we do to make this a place where bats can utilize this area again? So it's a great program. It's also just a great way to kind of like learn to differentiate between bats and birds in the sky, understand when they're present, look for good spots to find them, whether that's a backyard or a park or a rooftop, or even just looking out your window if you've got a great view. So it's a fun way to kind of get involved, kind of start thinking about what's going on around you. And it's one that anybody can participate in. It's totally free and a whole lot of fun. The other one is one that you guys can do in Methow Valley, which is very cool. So Oregon State University has a program that they're looking to expand into Washington, and are happy to have individual contributors up in Washington for. And this is an audible bat survey. So having spotted bats in your area means that you actually have bats you can listen for, which is very cool. Pallid bats also make some communication calls that are audible to human ears that you can also listen for and are also in the area. So spotted bats, while they're very elusive and pretty rare, are actually very widely distributed through kind of our semi-arid deserts across North America, including British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. So you can listen for their calls, and same thing, you can kind of record what you hear and submit it to Oregon State University's project at the Northwest Bat Hub, which is a very cool thing to have at a university, and help them figure out where both spotted bats and pallid bats are common. Both of these programs have online trainings every year. They have mailing lists that you can get on. Both of them have places you can go give your email and be alerted when things start up each year, and are a really fun way to get more involved in watching, observing, listening for bats, and understanding bat conservation in general. So the other thing that we like to talk about is creating bat habitat. One of the best things we can do about bats is just support the lands that they need to thrive. So that's thinking about water sources, thinking about prey and insects, thinking about roost locations. So, and we can do all of these naturally. We have a lot of ways to help bats that we don't really think about. Like a lot of us have garden areas or yards where we can plant things. Planting native plants increases our insect biodiversity. Focusing those plants on nocturnal insects, like planting night blooming flowers. So often that will be flowers with really light colored blooms, whites, yellows, pale colors like that reflect moonlight, or fragrant flowers. All of those bring in the insects that bats need to prey on. And so you're providing a food source for our bat populations. Large water sources aren't something everybody can supply, but if you're in a position to, bats have been shown to drink out of things like large horse troughs, man-made ponds, wetlands, and all of those things. So you can take care of some of those natural water sources by making sure invasive species like plant species are not taking over the waterways, or to make it so that bats wouldn't be able to come in and get their drink. You can have large sources with what we call like wildlife escape ramps, so a way for an animal to get out if they fall in. But keeping those filled up will sometimes help bats. And then, of course, just thinking about our water sources and making sure that they stay clean and healthy helps bats and all wildlife, honestly. And then in terms of roosts, we will talk about some artificial roosts, but natural roosts are always best. So there's lots of native tree species that we know are utilized by bats. Here we have our plant list for Eastern Washington, but we also on this website from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, they have a list of tree species that are used by bats and snag tree species that are used by bats. So snags, if you're not familiar with that term, is any tree that is starting to decompose but is still standing. So not like stumps or fallen trees, but before that, as they start to die, they actually start to soften and decompose. So that lets off heat and allows animals to more easily create crevices in them. And they're actually incredibly important for all wildlife, not just bats. But the number of mammal species and bird species they support is pretty off the charts. So if you have a tree like that and you're considering taking it down, there are ways to safely prune it first, reduce it in height, reduce limbs that could fall, and still keep that standing for wildlife, because they're incredibly useful for wildlife and for bats. So this is on Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's website. Bats Northwest has some of the same information on our website on creating habitat, either on your own property or on community spaces. All of that helps out a lot. One of the biggest things is loss of roosts. So if we want bats to stay in their natural places and not take some of ours, this is a great way to do that. Bat houses. I'm going to preface my bat house chat a little bit because bat houses have gotten really interesting in the last couple of years. So we had kind of gotten to a point where we'd figured out what to tell everybody about bat houses, what colors they liked, what shapes they liked, what sizes they liked. And then climate change showed up and kind of threw everything out the window by changing our environment quite a lot. And so the truth is we don't 100% know what the best practices for bat houses in Washington are anymore. There's a lot of conversation and research and surveys and projects going on to try and figure this out. So that's kind of why we talk about creating bat habitat first. It's that natural way that lets bats kind of figure these things out for themselves. They're surprisingly good at finding exactly what they're looking for in a roost, no matter where they are. But bat houses can also be a great conservation tool. They're a great way for supporting bats. Bat houses are not like bird houses. I'm sure you know that because bats and birds are so different. But a lot of times when people put up a bat house, they expect to see a group of bats move into it, and they'll be able to, see them during the day or hear them or note that they're there. But because Washington has these smaller groupings of bats and more solitary bats and bats that like move in very small groups, a lot of times people totally miss that their bat houses are being used. So one of the links I'll send you guys is a blog from Fish and Wildlife that talks about all the different roost uses, how to tell if a bat is using it. But the first thing I like to tell people about bat houses is that the bat houses are probably getting used, but they might just be getting used for a couple of nights during those migratory transition seasons in the spring and fall. They might be getting used by a single bat as a night roost so that they can sleep off their full stomach before they head out again. So it's very possible to have a bat house that is getting used for days or hours instead of weeks and months. So I often think of my bat house as like a bat B&B instead of a bat like permanent housing. And in fact, that played out. So when I put my most recent bat house up, I put it up in March of one spring. It didn't get used until the end of August. And then I had put it in a place where I could see the guano or the bat droppings. And that was the only way I knew it was getting used at first, is I had guano 2 different mornings over 2 different weeks. And eventually we did see the 2 bats fly off. It was probably a mom and her pup, since it was kind of early, almost fall. They were probably moving out from their maternity colony somewhere. But unless you get a maternity colony and that thing gets stuffed with like 50 bats, you might not notice that they are there. So have faith, you're still helping. But here's what we do know about bat houses. So we talked about our bats liking little crevices. So these bats are quite small. They probably have a wingspan of about 10 inches and weigh, almost nothing. But you can see how well they're jammed in there, and this is what they want. So when you do build bat houses, we recommend that they have small chambers. So somewhere between 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. That's kind of going to dictate what species uses it, and that's okay. Both of those size bats are here in Washington. And then we always recommend that whatever house you put up has multiple chambers, and also that it's a pretty big size. And a lot of that has to do with bats are all about their energy, and thermoregulation is a huge part of that. So we want to make sure that they can go where their needs are best met. So by having multiple chambers in a box, you're creating some natural insulation in both directions, in terms of kind of controlling the climate inside a little bit. And then the bats can do that too by changing chambers. If one chamber is getting more sun and it's getting too hot, or if one chamber is too cold, and they can move back somewhere more insulated. And so that's one thing we definitely recommend. Bat houses here in Washington should be large. 24 by 24 can sometimes be a minimum. Sometimes you'll go into hardware stores or birding stores. I've noticed being the 2 kind of big things that do this, and you'll see very small bat houses. It might be their best-selling bat house, but it's usually very small, and that looks really manageable, and that sounds great, but it's not what our bats here need, and it's not what they're going to be using. A lot of those are designed either inaccurately, or for bats in other regions of the United States, maybe it does work for some other place. But it's not what we recommend. And so the big size, the multiple chamber, and then always having venting in your box. A lot of boxes are sold without venting, but especially now as our summers are getting hotter and hotter, and that's when our bats are most active and out and using these bat houses, they need to have that airflow so that it doesn't overheat. Bat houses need a rough landing pad. Bats don't actually fly up and into bat houses to land. They're going to land outside and crawl their way up. So they need something for their claws to hold on to and kind of shimmy their way up into these chambers and around that bat house. Bat houses should be placed about 12 to 15 feet high, because as we talked about, bats need that high elevation and that gravity drop to come in and out of their bat houses. It's also going to better protect them from predators. So you're going to want to put it up someplace that is not easily accessed by predators. One of the biggest predators for bats in Washington and in the United States is actually house cats, as with a lot of wildlife. So things where an outdoor cat, if there is one in your area, couldn't jump from a ledge or a roof or a fence to that bat house. And that's true for other animals as well. So you can place bat house on freestanding posts. You can also place them on buildings. We no longer recommend that you put them in trees. That's something that people used to be told. But it was kind of discovered that that made them way too susceptible to predators, whether that was something climbing up the bark of a tree and into the bat house, or a bird of prey kind of roosting or sitting on limbs above, just waiting for those bats to come out. So we recommend not trees. We have found kind of nationwide that bat houses on buildings are more commonly occupied than those on freestanding posts. They're also less prone to the overheating. Freestanding posts in full sun can get really hot these days when our summers get those extreme heat events. So bat houses also require maintenance. A lot of people, we didn't really talk about that a lot before the last few years. So making sure that it's still in good shape means making sure it's still watertight, it still has clear vents, it hasn't been taken over by insects or insect casings, which sometimes happen. So in the winter, once our bats have moved either to migrate or hibernate, you can pretty easily check and make sure it's empty, and then there's a couple of different ways. There's some videos on the Bats Northwest website about how you can clean those bat houses out, and then just kind of recock, reseal, all those good things. The other thing we're starting to recommend, because there's so much that we're not knowing about bat houses right now, is that if you have the ability or the capacity, that you can put up more than one bat house in a variety of locations or use a variety of bat house styles, just to kind of see what the bats in your area like best. A lot of times we talk about bats like they're all the same thing, but we have 14 different species and they have 14 different wants out of their roosts and 14 different circumstances. So you kind of never know what's going to be used where you are until you experiment a little bit. If you're wondering if your bat house is getting used, that guano tip is kind of the best in my opinion. So if you've got a bat house that isn't over a really clear surface that you can see easily, you can always put something white underneath on a few dry nights, like towels, sheets, paper, to see if any of those guano pellets appear. Histoplasmosis is not here in Washington, so you can actually like mess with the guano a little bit, though do it with gloves on and don't breathe it in too much just because that's gross. But bat droppings look a lot like mouse droppings, except if you do have a gloved hand and can kind of squish them a little bit, because it's all insects, it's going to dissolve like dust and be a little shimmery. So that's another way to tell if you've got bats in your attic or mice, is you can always check that way as well. So another thing we used to say about bat houses, if some of you have been around a while or putting up before, is we used to recommend that people paint them black in Washington. And that was because as a temperate state, they thought that the black paint would absorb heat and keep things warm. It does. In fact, painting a bat house or a birdhouse black can actually add like 15 to 20 degrees of internal temperature, which now that our summers get as hot as they do, can be really bad. So especially on the east side of the state, if you're putting your bat house somewhere that gets a lot of sun, you can still paint it, but I would paint it a much lighter color. If it is somewhere that gets more shade, but could still get high temperatures in the summer, maybe a medium tone, but nothing like black anymore, especially in Eastern Washington. We also don't recommend that you use screening or netting. I know my picture had that. It was an older picture, but it can trap bat claws. Those little bat claws are tiny, especially if you do end up with maternity situation in your bat house. You wouldn't ever want to trap a bat, so it's better just to rough up bat house interiors with a wire brush, or use kind of an unfinished wood that has some natural roughness to it. So those are a few things. We can always talk more about bat houses. If you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can also reach out to us at Bats Northwest if you have specific questions about your bat house, and we're happy to help. There's just a whole wide variety and a whole lot of information. If you really want to learn everything about bat houses, U.S. Fish and Wildlife just put out a 200-page bat house guide for the United States, which I haven't finished yet because it was like last week, but I'm sure it will also be very helpful. British Columbia also has a great guide that we have linked on our website. All right, so we're almost done. I have a couple last things for you. So there was a little bit of a request of what if I want to learn even more about all things bats. So I have a couple of recommendations for both adults and kids. There's actually a ton of great kids bat related books. I probably could have filled the whole page with like 20 of the best ones. Fewer with adults, but there's still really good stuff out there. So if you want to learn about local bats, the Bats of British Columbia is a field guide by some of the Canadian BC biologists. It's fantastic. It's thorough. It's very in-depth. It's species by species. So what Bats Northwest has on their website for each species, if you want to learn even more, that's a great source. They just redid it in the last couple of years. So it's really current, really up to date. And British Columbia has very similar habitats to Washington. And it covers both Eastern and Western for their state, and it's very relevant to us, with a couple of species that we don't really have record of here, but most of them are the same. And then the other two books are just really fun reads. One's more story-oriented, a biography of one of our most famous bat biologists in the country, and then this Bats Illustrated Guide is pictures of 800 different species and all the diversity you could ever want, and they're very cool photos. Kids books are great. Most people have heard of Stella Luna. The other two are newer. The bat book is a little bit more science-based explanation, learn all about bats and their biology. Amara and the Bats is a really great story about kids taking on habitat restoration and passion projects themselves. So recommend all of those. If you have bat questions beyond what we can help you with the Bats Northwest, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife does have a statewide bat biologist. Abby Tobin is running all of the white nose syndrome outreach and research, and is a great resource if you're having issues in your area that you have specific questions about, or if you want to report a colony. She's a great person to turn to. And then I'll put this link with everything else in the chat. But this is a list of all the rehabilitators. If you ever come across a bat that needs help and you want to get it to someone who can help it out, we have licensed rehabilitators across the state who specialize in bats. And of course, Sarah's Bat Rehab is in Moses Lake. I know that's a little ways, but it was the closest I could find. So I just wanted you guys to have that info, though you can always reach out to us and we can talk you through all sorts of things, including there's a bat in my attic, or what is this bat doing on the side of my building? Or what do I do with this bat my cat just found?
I want to jump in just for the sake of time. I want to thank everyone for being here, and the conversation doesn't have to stop now, but if you've got other places to go, feel free to take off. Any final thoughts before we part ways for the evening?
No, I think this was great. Thank you so much for having me. There's a lot of cool bat work going on in your area. So definitely keep your eyes and ears open. If you're interested in helping, I know that Fish and Wildlife has a volunteer sign up that may occasionally include bat related opportunities. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and I hope everybody sees some bats when they come back and visit us again in the spring.